Welcome to the 13th and final lesson in this video study of the book of Daniel. As we conclude our study of Daniel's vision of the exalted man, an abrupt transition in the narrative occurs at verse 36, but it's unnoticeable without some knowledge of the historical realities reflected in the apocalyptic imagery of the vision. The major adversaries are still the king of the north and the king of the south. And up to this point, the king of the north has been the Seleucid Empire. But from verse 36 forward, Daniel's messenger removes the mantle and title of king of the north from the Seleucid Empire and places them on Rome. How do we know this? Two observations. First of all, nothing in this vision is consistent with the historical record of the reign of Antiochus IV. All of chapter 11, up to this point, contains strikingly accurate predictions of the whole sweep of events from the reign of Cyrus the Great, during whose reign Daniel's career came to a close, up to the unsuccessful effort of Antiochus Epiphanes to stamp out the Jewish faith. From verses 5 through 35, everything predicted in the vision about the activities of the king of the north were fulfilled in the reigns of the Seleucid kings, with most of the emphasis falling on three specific rulers. Seleucus I, Nicator, the founder of the Seleucid Empire, in verse 5, Antiochus III, the Great, the most powerful and successful of the Seleucid kings, in verses 10 through 19, and Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, the monstrous persecutor of the Jews, in verses 21 to 35. Now, when we look at verses 36 to 45, they would seem at first glance to be continuing the narrative concerning Antiochus IV. Upon closer inspection, however, we'll see that none of the events described in this part of the vision agree with the historical record of the latter part of his reign. The king of the south, that is Egypt, never moved against Antiochus, as we will see depicted in these verses. It was always Antiochus who was the aggressor in the wars between the two kingdoms. And Antiochus never waged another war, much less a successful one, against Egypt after his humiliating stare-down with Roman officials in 168 BC. And he certainly never conquered Libya or Ethiopia. In the verses we'll be looking at, the king of the north does precisely that. Antiochus was never master of all the riches that we'll see mentioned in verse 43. In fact, he had to take desperate measures to pay the larcenous tribute that Rome had levied on Syria during his father's reign. And finally, Antiochus was not the religious chameleon that we'll see described in verses 36 to 48. Paying lip service to whatever God was necessary in order to get his way. He was an ardent Hellenist who tried to suppress all other religions, and especially Judaism. So whoever the king of the north depicted in these verses is, he certainly cannot have been Antiochus Epiphanes, nor any of his successors. They simply don't match the prophetic profile. A second observation. Not only is the identification of the king of the north in these verses with Rome consistent with the historical record, it also fits well with the scope and pattern of the book up to this point. Consider the following points. Rome has already been put into play in the book of Daniel as the legs and feet of the great image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. To discuss the fate of the Jews in the end time without including the Roman involvement would be ludicrous. The characteristics of the king of the north, presented in verses 36 to 45, fit the Roman character and policy to a T. Third, the military encounter described in verse 40 fits a specific, decisive battle of the Roman era as precisely as the conflicts described earlier in verses 10 and 14 fit the Seleucid area battles of Raphia and Panium. And finally, the association of the king of the north with Rome places the vision of the exalted man in harmony with Gabriel's vision of the 70 weeks, with both foreseeing the destruction of the Jewish commonwealth during the Roman era. So in verses 36 to 45, we have skipped over 20 or so minor Seleucid rulers and a little over 100 years in time to arrive at the era of Roman dominion over both Syria and Egypt. The Seleucid Empire was overrun by Roman armies under Pompey in 64 BC. From that time forward, it was the Romans who waged war from the north against the Ptolemaic regime in Egypt, the last surviving vestige of the Empire of Alexander. At this point, it's a little too early to refer to Rome as an empire. The historical events alluded to in this vision occurred during the last years of the Roman Republic, just before its transition to empire status in 27 BC. So let's look at what the exalted man prophesied about the time after the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabean rebellion. What was prophesied? Daniel 11, verses 36 to 39. Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. And he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. But instead, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasure. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him and cause them to rule over the many, and will parcel out land for a price. That's what's prophesied. How did it happen? Verses 36 and following are still talking about the king of the north, a king who will do as he pleases and will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. Verse 37 states that he will show no regard for the God of his fathers or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god. There are all kinds of interests or values that can drive human behavior. Religion, family values, tradition, sex, etc. None of these things will matter to this king. Yet, in verse 38, we're told that he will honor a god of fortresses, a god whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. And in verse 39, we read, he will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. So, which is true? Does this king of the north revere a god or gods, or does he not? The answer is that both are true. For this king, religion is only a political expedient, a strategy. He is a narcissistic psychopath who cares nothing for anything or anyone. All he cares about is his own power. And whatever it takes to gain power, he'll do it. He'll offer up sacrifices to any and every god if it will attain his end, which is unrivaled, perpetual power. These verses are a much more accurate depiction of Roman policy towards the religious practices of their vassal nations than the policies of Antiochus Epiphanes. For Antiochus, the Greek pantheon was supreme, and all other religions were to be suppressed. Rome didn't care. One god, many gods, no gods, it didn't matter, as long as the demands of the gods didn't conflict with the ambitions of Rome. Verse 39 goes on to say that this version of the king of the north will seek out collaborators among the nations he has conquered, endowing them with wealth and power. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him and will cause them to rule over the many and will parcel out land for a price. This alludes to the Roman policy of maintaining peace and order in its vassal states through client kings. When Rome conquered a territory or a nation, the indigenous strongmen who would submit most readily, suppress nationalism most effectively, and pay the taxes on time were the men given places of leadership. Herod the Great of Judea is a prime example. A man of absolutely no religious or moral scruples, he is best remembered for his lavish project of enlarging and beautifying the temple of God in Jerusalem. Far from being an act of religious devotion, it was a political ploy aimed at swaying the independent-minded Jews into accepting their lot as Roman subjects. At this point, we should remember the image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. The legs of iron represented Rome, and the feet of mixed iron and clay represented the unnatural mingling of nations and ethnic groups within the Roman Republic and later the empire. This part of the dream envisioned just such alliances as we're reading about here. It is vitally important for us to note that verse 36 declares that this king will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. The indignation is the outpouring of God's wrath on the Jewish commonwealth through the agency of Rome. This king of the north will be permitted to prevail and prosper until God is through with him as an instrument of punishment upon his rebellious people. Jesus made the same point in his prediction of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in Luke 21, verses 23 and 24. There will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. All this is to say that the awesome power and violent depredation of the king of the north was not simply a result of the random ebb and flow of human history. Rather, it is that which is decreed that will be done. Over and over again, we're told in Scripture that the times and seasons of human history are decreed by the will of God. The sovereignty is His. No king succeeds without God's permission, and no nation is destroyed, but God is behind it. Well, with the Seleucid Empire already subdued, verse 40 very succinctly prophesies the Roman conquest of the Ptolemaic regime in Egypt. What was prophesied? At the end time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships. And he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. How did this happen? The end time in the book of Daniel consistently refers to the time of Roman dominion. Remember again the legs of iron, the last in the series of empires depicted in Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the great multifarious image. The Roman time is the last time, the end time. The following verses accurately describe the Roman conquest of Egypt. The king of the south at this time was actually a queen, the famous Cleopatra VII. At one time, she'd been a mistress of Julius Caesar and had borne him a son. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, she married Mark Antony, who was in competition with Caesar's nephew and adopted son, Octavian, for supremacy in Rome. Hoping to make Egypt the center of world power, Cleopatra goaded Antony into making a military move against Octavian. And in response, at Octavian's request, the Roman Senate declared war against Cleopatra and declared Mark Antony a traitor. So the war between Octavian and Antony was not, strictly speaking, a Roman civil war, but actually a war between the king of the north, which is Rome, and the king of the south, which is Egypt. The battle depicted in verse 40, fought with chariot, cavalry, and ships, corresponds to the decisive battle of Actium on the west coast of the Greek peninsula in 31 BC. Although Antony had the superior ground forces, the ships in his navy were seriously undermanned. Nevertheless, he gave in to the strong-willed Cleopatra's wishes and drew up a battle plan that would stand or fall on the success of a naval confrontation in the harbor beneath the promontory of Actium. And sure enough, in the ensuing sea battle, Antony's navy was routed, which so unnerved his infantry that they deserted to Octavian. And the remainder of the battle was fought between horsemen and chariots and resulted in a disastrous defeat for the Egyptian forces. In the aftermath of the Battle of Actium, Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide, and Octavian was left the undisputed master of Rome. He's better known as Augustus Caesar, the first of the Roman emperors, although the Roman Empire per se would not be established for another 4 years. The next step for Octavian was to exert his authority over Judea. What was prophesied? Verses 41 through 45. He will also enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall, but these will be rescued out of his hand: Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. Then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. But he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. And Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. But rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. How was this fulfilled? The Roman conquest of Judea had actually been accomplished in 63 BC by the Roman general and Julius Caesar's arch-rival, Pompey. Herod the Great, whose father had enjoyed a close relationship with Julius Caesar, was appointed provincial governor of Galilee in 47 BC, 1 year after Pompey's death. He proved himself to be an able and loyal administrator, and in 40 BC, the Roman Senate endowed Herod with the title King of the Jews. Before the Battle of Actium, political power over the Roman domains was divided by the Senate between 3 men, collectively known as the Triumvirate. The triumvir over the eastern half of the Republic, which included Syria, Judea, and Egypt, was Mark Antony. And Herod, as the client king of Judea, was intensely loyal to him. After the Battle of Actium and Mark Antony's suicide, Roman armies loyal to Octavian occupied Judea, Egypt, and the Egyptian dependencies of Libya and Ethiopia, consolidating and strengthening Octavian's hold on what had been Antony's seat of power. Read about that in verses 41 and 42. Herod, as brilliant a politician as he was ruthless a king, saved his life and his kingdom by pledging to Octavian the same unwavering loyalty that he had shown for Mark Antony. However, the Roman attempt to conquer the neighboring countries of Moab, Edom, and Ammon failed miserably, as we see in verse 41. Rome was frequently engaged in war with the savage Germanic tribes to the north and the Parthian Empire to the east. And although they won some impressive victories against them, these nations were never subjugated and posed a continuous threat to the Roman Empire throughout its existence. Verse 45 summarily describes the Roman occupation of Judea and Jerusalem. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. The geographical reference is to the historical land of Israel, with special attention on Jerusalem, the holy mountain. Between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River lay the heart of the Jewish homeland. And there the king of the north, Rome, would pitch the tents of his royal pavilion. Roman power would be absolute and devastating for as long as it lasted. But when God's purposes for it had been accomplished, it was destined for a sure and certain end. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. The first 4 verses of chapter 12 actually belong to the vision of chapter 11. In apocalyptic imagery, they prophesy the final destruction of the Jewish national entity, while alluding to the coming of the long-anticipated Messiah. The contents of these verses correspond to the 70th week of Daniel's vision from Gabriel in chapter 9. What was prophesied? Chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. Now at that time, Michael, the great prince, who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. And there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time your people, every one who is found written in the book, will be rescued. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Those who have insight will shine brightly, like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever. But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. That's the prophecy. How did it happen? These verses are the climax of Daniel's vision of the exalted man. In chapter 10, verse 14, Daniel's messenger promised to give you an understanding of what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision pertains to the days yet future. Chapter 11 brings us through the entire history of the successive empires up to the time of the Roman conquest of Judea. Now, the end of those latter days is at hand. Now at that time, says the exalted man, that is, the time when Rome has pitched its tents in the Jewish homeland, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. We've already met Michael in the introductory section of the vision in chapter 10. He appears to be a kind of guardian angel for the faithful people of God, especially during times of adversity. It had been Michael's task to preserve and protect the holy people through the distress of Persian and Greek imperial rule. And now, with the Jews under the yoke of Roman rule, he exerts himself again. If this is a job for Michael, it must mean that things are going to get bad. And indeed, the Roman dominion of the Jews would have a much different outcome from the others. Under the Romans, the Jewish people will experience a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And that sounds an awful lot like Jesus' prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew 24 and verse 21. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. This is a most unnerving statement, because the Jews had endured some times of extreme distress throughout their history. They had seen their temple destroyed, their king dethroned, and the once powerful dynasty of David brought to an ignominious end. They had been forcefully removed from their homeland and sent into exile in Babylon. However, At the end of that long exile, they had been allowed to come back to their land, rebuild their temple, and reestablish their nation. And even though they now lived as a conquered nation, subject to the whim and caprice of foreign overlords, they were, nevertheless, a nation. The difference was that the Roman dominion would result not only in another violent destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, but the complete dissolution of the Jewish national identity and the dispersion of the Jewish people among the nations. Through the protection of Michael, however, everyone whose name is found written in the book will be rescued, delivered through, but not necessarily from, this unprecedented distress. Although the book is not explicitly identified in Daniel, the concept of God's book of life, containing the names of all his holy ones, is at least as old as Moses. And you can reference Exodus 32:32 for that. New Testament references to the book of life are found in Luke 10 and 20 and Revelation 20 and verse 12. Verse 2 sounds like a reference to the final resurrection and judgment, but I really don't think it is. It's a very big leap from the time of the Roman dominion over Judea in verse 1 to a picture of the end of time judgment in verse 2. I believe that verse 2 continues the description of the Roman destruction of the Jewish nation. And the reference to the resurrection and judgment is a comparison or an analogy, similar to Jesus' analogy in Matthew 24:28, where in predicting this very event of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, he said, "Where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." The Judeo-Roman War of AD 67 through 70 would be the death of the Jewish nation, the consequence of their wholesale rejection and crucifixion of their Messiah. And I think verse 2 alludes to the final resurrection and judgment, but it borrows more of the imagery of the separation and judgment aspect of that final resurrection rather than of the resurrection event itself. It alludes to the coming of the Messiah and Israel's response to him. Some would accept him and rise to everlasting life. They are the ones who will shine brightly, like the brightness of the expanse of heaven. They are the ones who will lead the many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever. Others, however, would reject him and rise to shame and everlasting contempt. So the imagery, I believe, is borrowed from the final resurrection and judgment, as described in Jesus' sheep and goats discourse in Matthew 25. But the application is the final destruction of the existence of Israel as a nation by Rome in AD 70, and the fate of its people based on either their acceptance or their rejection of the Messiah. At the end of the vision, Daniel is instructed by the exalted man to seal up the scroll until the end of time. How long would that be? Earlier in the vision, the exalted man referred to the end time as the time when the king of the north, that is Rome, would become God's unwitting instrument for venting his wrath against his faithless people. Chapter 11 ends with the description of the initial Roman invasion of the Jewish homeland. That would mark the beginning of the end time. And then chapter 12 begins, "Now at that time Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise." And that's followed with a prophecy of the fall of Jerusalem, a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. Therefore, the end of time in chapter 12 and verse 4 must refer to the climax or culmination of the end time, when the appointed destruction of the Jewish commonwealth finally comes to pass. In effect, it would be the end of the end time, And all this agrees perfectly with the exalted man's statement in verse 7 that as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. Verses 5 through 13 of chapter 12 serve as a concluding epilogue to the vision of the exalted man. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on this bank of the river, and the other on that bank of the river. And one said to the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, "How long will it be until the end of these wonders?" I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left towards heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. As for me, I heard, but could not understand. So I said, "My Lord, what will be the outcome of these things?" He said, "Go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end time. Many will be purged, purified, and refined. But the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand. But those who have insight will understand. From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days. But as for you, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age." As the vision comes to an end, Daniel sees the exalted man hovering above a river, where he is joined by two other angelic beings standing on opposite banks of the same river. One of these beings asks the exalted man a rhetorical question: "How long will it be until the end of these wonders?" The messenger responds with a powerful oath that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. Again, the apocalyptic chronology of 3.5 times appears, apparently denoting an unspecified interval of time during which God employs specific nations, people, or circumstances to accomplish his own divine purposes in the world. Thus, although Daniel has been given a minutely detailed account of what will happen in the remote future, he is not given a precise chronology or timetable for these events. It's the event themselves, not the time of their occurrence, that is important. He is told only that as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. The crucial importance of this one little verse as a control for interpreting the entire vision, and indeed the entire book of Daniel, cannot be overemphasized. The shattering of the power of the holy people was fulfilled in the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And this provides the terminal point for the historical fulfillment of the vision of the exalted man. Any interpretation which extends its scope beyond that time is missing the point. And that's why I believe that the judgment described in verse 2 is almost certainly not a reference to the literal judgment at the end of time, but is rather a figurative judgment when the Jewish people were judged based on their response to the Messiah when he came to them. Everything Daniel has seen in this long vision will begin and end within the scope and limits of human history. More specifically, between the time of the Persian Empire and the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Daniel is left confused and perplexed by the vagueness of this vision, as we might expect. As it stands, a number of issues and questions are left open by the abrupt end of the vision. What will happen to the Jews after their power has finally been broken? What of the oppressors, that is Rome, who break their power? How long then will they be allowed to hold sway over the earth? What will become of the saints who have been placed under the care and protection of Michael? Daniel's question is, in effect, what then? And the exalted man is not willing to answer any of these questions in any detail. Daniel must be content with two vague revelations. First, in the time which lies beyond the scope of his vision, the righteous will continue to be righteous, and the wicked will continue to be wicked. Many will be purged, purified, and refined, but the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand, but those who have insight will understand. This seems to refer to the human response to the gospel as it was and continues to be preached throughout the world. I think there's an interesting parallel here between the preaching of the gospel and the plea of the anti-Hellenistic Jews during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Speaking of those who preach the gospel in chapter 12, the text says, many will be purged, purified, and refined. Those who have insight will understand. Speaking of the anti-Hellenists in chapter 11, some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure. Second, as for the Roman oppressor, the exalted man says that the duration of his power beyond the destruction of the Jerusalem state will be 1,290 days. That's equal to 3.5 years. A time times and half a time, plus 30 days. This is obviously another apocalyptic way of saying that the duration of time is fixed but not revealed. The significance of the extra 30 days beyond the time times and half a time is not clear. In light of the certain demise of the oppressor after the 1,290 days, a blessing is promised for those who reach the 1,335 days, which is 3 years, 8 months, and 15 days, or 45 days beyond the end of the power of the oppressor. And there must have been some significance to the number 1,335 for Daniel. But again, it has been lost to us. The primary meaning of the statement, though, is clear. Those who remain faithful to the end of the oppression will be rewarded. One last observation I want to make here. In verse 8, Daniel asks his heavenly messenger, "My Lord, what will be the outcome of these events?" And in verse 9, the exalted man replies that the answer to his question is concealed and sealed up until the end of time. Then in verse 13, Daniel receives his final answer, as it were. "But as for you, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age." There are some interesting and important nuances in meaning here that are easy to miss in the English translation of these verses. All through the vision of the exalted man, as here in verse 9, we have been noting the references to the end time or the end of time. But here in verse 13, Daniel is promised that he will receive his allotted portion at the end of the age. These translations reflect two different words in the original Hebrew text. The word et, translated time, generally refers to a defined or measurable duration of time, such as a season, an era, or an epoch. The word yom, translated age, can be synonymous with et, but it can also apply to an unlimited or undefined period. Daniel is told that he will receive his allotted portion at the end of the ages. In other words, while the prophecies in the vision of the exalted man all look ahead to a time, et, when the power of the Jewish commonwealth will finally be broken, Daniel is promised a reward at the end of the ages, Yamin, the plural of Yom. That is, at a point when all the times of human history have come and gone. If you're wondering why the text on the screen here reads end of the age instead of end of the ages, let me explain. This is the text of the New American Standard Bible, which is usually my favorite for study and teaching. But for some reason in this verse, it translates a Hebrew plural as an English singular. Almost every other English version faithfully renders the plural ages. And yes, I'm disappointed that my dear old NASB does not, because I think it makes a difference in how we understand what Daniel is being told here. In contrast to verse 2, the end of the ages here in verse 13 does seem to refer to the final resurrection and judgment at the end of historical time. The same resurrection and judgment that is depicted in Revelation 20, verses 11 to 15. And thus, by providential design, it would seem, the message of the book of Daniel flows naturally and smoothly into that of the book of Revelation. We might even dare to ascribe to Revelation the subtitle, Daniel 2, the rest of the story. And with that, we bring this long and detailed study of the book of Daniel to an end. Parts of it have been familiar to us since childhood. The story of the fiery furnace, or Daniel in the lion's den. Parts of it perhaps have brought exciting new discoveries, like the period of Nebuchadnezzar's insanity, and the origin and true meaning of the expression, seeing the writing on the wall. And parts of it, like the long and mysterious vision of the exalted man, may have been tedious and challenging. But through all its dreams, visions, and human drama, one unifying and timeless theme comes through loud and clear in the book of Daniel. God is the absolute sovereign ruler of this world. Is the world we live in today, with war, terrorism, and violent crime dominating the headlines, totally and irreversibly out of control? Are the nations of the earth hopelessly subjected to the whims of leaders who have lost all sense of statesmanship and public responsibility, using their lofty positions only to enhance their personal wealth, prestige, and power? Is the human race doomed to a permanent state of depravity, calling good evil and evil good, wallowing blissfully in its own perversion like a hog in the mud? Was Friedrich Nietzsche right way back in 1882 when he wrote, "God is dead"? The book of Daniel answers all of these questions with a firm and confident no. In 1901, Maltby D. Babcock wrote a hymn that we still sing entitled, "This is My Father's World." The final stanza of that song begins, "This is my Father's world. Oh, let me ne'er forget that though the wrong seem oft so strong, God is the ruler yet." That effectively sums up the message of the book of Daniel. But I want to end this study with the words of a much more ancient and much more inspired songwriter, and that is the author of Psalm 2. Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together, against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, "Let us tear their fetters apart, and cast away their cords from us." He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger, and terrifying them in his fury, saying, "But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give you the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall shatter them like earthenware. Now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence, and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, that he may not become angry, and you perish in the way. For his wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in him. Thank you for joining me in this study of the great book of Daniel. May the God who rules the nations bless and keep you.
You will reign forever. Fill the earth. You will reign forever. Fill the earth. You will reign forever. Fill the earth. You will reign forever. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King. Nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King. Nothing can